Hello, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Economic Resilience, Navigating Challenges for Government Leaders. My name is Reva Feldman, and I'm a retired city manager from the city of Malibu, California. I spent my entire career in local government. I came up through finance and administration, so I have developed countless budgets and been very deep in a lot of economics and city finance related matters. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers. We have Jerry Nicholsberg, who's the director of UCLA Anderson Forecast and an adjunct professor of economics at UCLA Anderson School of Business. Jerry is a wealth of knowledge, and he'll be sharing some very insightful information on our local, national, and world economies. We are also joined by Fran Mancia, the Vice President of Government Relations for Avenu Insights and Analytics. Fran is an expert in all things related to federal and state legislation and policies that affect local governments. You can find more information about our speakers in the briefing information that we sent via email. For over 40 years, Avenu Insights has served state and local governments, and we currently have over 3,500 clients throughout the country. We have a pretty good sense of what's weighing on the minds of government leaders, and that's why Avenu partnered with UCLA Anderson Forecast, an organization with a 70-year history of producing some of the most accurate forecasts for our country. So we're glad today to be able to bring you this very important information. I'd like to hand it over to Fran now, who'll be providing us a legislative update. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Reva. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. For those of you who have joined our webinars in the past, we like to start off with a legislative update. And I think at this time, it's one of the most uncertain times in our country's history and certainly in the world. And events are changing, as we all know, literally by the hour. As we look at things at the federal level, we've obviously seen a lot of delays in terms of selecting a speaker and some dysfunction in the House of Representatives that certainly needs to be worked on. And whatever the outcome is over the coming weeks and months, there will be repercussions to the economy. We have had shutdowns. With the wars that have taken place, we knew whatever happens will have a domino effect on the economy. And it certainly sets the stage for the primary elections in March of 2024 and certainly the general elections in November of next year. The one thing I might note is we're having a lot of conversation about who may or may not be in office, yet we still have over a year until we come to those decision points. So a lot can happen in the coming months. So I'll stop my remarks around legislation at that point, but just bearing in mind things can change rapidly. And we have that in mind as we look at the economy and especially as we look towards the resilience going into 2024. Thank you, Reva.
Thanks so much, Fran. Jerry, we're going to hand it to you to tell us how we are doing. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here with Fran and Reva and all of our friends at Avenu Insights for our quarterly update. So let me start with a few slides, but what we're going to do is the same as we've done in these past updates. We're going to go back and forth from the macroeconomy to things that affect local government and tax revenues as we go through these slides. So let's get started with them. I'm entitling these slides "The Unexpected Robust Economy," which sounds a little strange. Robust economy because over the last 18 months, the economy has been growing, not at barn burner rates, but at pretty good rates through the last quarter and actually through this quarter. We're going to talk about that. Unexpected because the majority of economists, not us at the UCLA Anderson Forecast, but the majority of economists predicted 18 months ago that the next quarter we would have a recession, and then the next quarter that we'd have a recession, and the next one. And those recessions never came. And that's the unexpected. We want to talk about why that's the case. But the reason why those predictions were out there was the Federal Reserve, whose Board of Governors building is pictured here, has been raising interest rates and raising them very aggressively. And in the past, increases in interest rates have resulted in interest-sensitive sectors contracting and inducing a recession. And that hasn't happened this time. one thing to keep in mind, which I think is maybe the most important message today, is that we're in a post-pandemic world and things have changed, which means that past data is not necessarily the best guide for what's going to happen in the future. We have to look behind the data and try and understand what is happening. So our roadmap for today, we want to take a look at the macro outlook, which is GDP, inflation, interest rates, and the like, and then at interest sensitive and other sectors, the things that build up into the forecast that I will have shown you in the macro outlook. And then importantly, as Fran has indicated, the risk to the outlook. There are more risks today to our economic outlook than there have been even in the recent past. Let's start with the macro outlook. And this is our forecast for GDP growth. It's seasonally adjusted annual rates of growth quarterly. The last data that we have is at that vertical black line, 2.1% growth. The last quarter, the quarter that just finished a couple weeks ago, we're forecasting that when the numbers come out, it's going to be 2.7% growth. We've seen really good growth all the way through the quarter, then slowing to 2% and then sub 2% for 4 quarters as we move into 2024. So I want to talk about why we get this slow growth in 2024, but not a recession. And then as we get into 2025, the economy grows back to trend at 2.4%. Another way to look at GDP is to look at the levels and past trends. So the blue here are the actuals, the reds are our forecast, and the dashed line is the 2018-2019 trend line, 2.4%. And you notice that the blues and reds to the right of the pandemic recession are all below trend. And so one might ask, well, if the economy is underperforming, why do we have such low unemployment, and why is the Fed concerned about inflation? Well, we had in 2020 millions of boomers retire, boomers who had stayed in the workforce for an additional 8 to 10 years because the equity in their homes was lacking as far as retirement savings, and they have finally retired, and we have a smaller number of people in the workforce. So you have fewer people doing things, you get lower GDP. So if we adjust that line to reflect the fact that we have a smaller workforce today than we had prior to 2020, we get that we're just about on or above trend. But as we go forward, that week 2024 takes us below trend, and we really don't get back to trend by the end of 2025. But that is in an economy with a 3.8% unemployment rate. It is elevated a bit from where it was, but it's still a very low unemployment rate. And that is in part what the Federal Reserve is looking at in terms of interest rate policy. And this slide shows you inflation, and this is the concern of the Federal Reserve and what they're thinking about as to whether or not they're going to raise interest rates again and by how much. To the left of the vertical line is headline inflation. That is based on a bundle of goods, and I'll show you that momentarily, a bundle of goods that have been costed by a survey every month. And you can see it went up to over 9%, and then it drops and drops to 3.7% where we are today. That's year over year. If we just look at the last 3 months, it's at 3.3%, much lower. And then the black line there is the actuals for core, which takes out the more volatile food and energy prices. That is a more stable measure of inflation, but it hasn't come down by as much, and it's at 4.3% year over year today. So we have high inflation, and in our forecast, both are coming down, but they come down to about 2.8%. That's not the Fed's 2%. So we want to talk about what's going on there and how that might inform the Fed in terms of future interest rate increases. But where we go is core at 3.2% and headline at 2.8% by the end of 2025. So let's break that down. This is the consumer price index. It's core inflation. Now the Fed looks at a slightly different measure, but the analysis would be exactly the same. And so this is August 2023, our latest data. In this, the cumulative contribution to inflation is the orange plus the blue. So in that basket of goods that I just described, the survey goes and measures the price of each one of those goods. And then it's weighted by the average, by the proportion of the average household's budget that is spent on those goods. So if you look over on the left-hand side, you see, for example, alcohol. Alcohol gets a very small weight because on average, alcohol is a small part of American household budgets. Obviously, some are much larger, some are much smaller. On average, it gets a small weight. And if we look at the cumulative, going from left to right, where the orange is the contribution of each of these elements, we see that we get all the way over to the right-hand side. And there are really only two things driving inflation in August. This is year over year. The first one is shelter, and that's a big part of it. That's most of the inflation that we're seeing now. That is rents. It does not count mortgages. So it's the rents that 1/3 of Americans are paying, and it's an average over the year. And so this comes down very slowly, and that's why we don't have inflation coming down more rapidly, because rents are paid based on longer-term leases. The leases come due, they get adjusted, and then finally it works its way out of the inflation metric. And increases in interest rates, if they affect rents at all, affect them in the opposite direction, because it pushes people out of purchasing homes and increases demand for rental units. So the Fed can't affect rents very much, and that's a big part of inflation. The second is other transportation, and that is almost all in automobile repair and in the insurance to cover that. And there are two things going on here. One is that we have been underbuying and underbuilding automobiles. So the age of the US automotive fleet has increased. And that means that there are more and more repairs happening to these older cars. Increased demand for automobile repairs have pushed up prices. But the bulk of this is because the cars that we're driving today are electric cars, or they may be internal combustion engine cars, but they have driver assist. They have lots of sensors, and those are expensive to repair. Just to give you an example, if you were to need to replace your windshield because a rock hit it, all the sensors are fine. The only thing you need to do is replace the glass. It used to be that was $300, maybe $350. Today, it's anywhere between $1,500 and $2,700, because you have to take the sensors off, put them back on, recalibrate them, and that takes a skilled technician. It can't be done in your driveway. And so that is basically a change in the product. So just like an iPhone 15 is not the same as a flip phone, cars today are not the same as cars in the past. And increases in interest rates have very little effect on that, though increases in gas prices certainly increase the measure of inflation from other transportation. I want to ask Fran and Reba about that momentarily, but just one other comment before we do that, and that's medical services is the third one, and you see that it's negative, but this includes health insurance, and health insurance premia are going up and going up rapidly. So that's going to be a contributor to that inflation that you saw in that earlier diagram. But let's go back to other transportation, because I think that's probably really quite important for local governments, in that it affects gasoline taxes, it affects it affects sales taxes. And so, Fran, let me just start and ask you, what are you seeing as you kind of look across the country in terms of the impact of this shift in the kinds of cars that we're driving on local government revenues?
Yeah, and that's Jerry. It's a great question. I think it's going to vary from state to state, but overall, the acceleration in the purchase of electric vehicles is far surpassing estimates, and I think a lot of it has to do with pricing of electric cars are expensive, yes, but they're starting to come down to be more affordable. Obviously, in various states, gasoline prices are up across the country, certainly more pronounced in states like California, Texas, and other places. But we're seeing a really a large increase in the purchase of cars. As an example, in California, of all the new car sales in 2020, only 7.5% of those new car sales were electric vehicles. By 2023, we're expected to be 24.5% of the car sales in California will be electric. And we're seeing that in states across the country. I think there is a direct correlation to the states where the gas prices are the highest. You're seeing a more rapid increase in the purchase of electric vehicles. And then, so back to Jerry's question, how does that impact revenues? Most states are very reliant on general retail, of course, for sales tax generation. That's always important and always will be. But car sales and gas sales are from a tax perspective, it's certainly a good thing for us as consumers. So we're seeing those correlations. But as over time, as the
Okay, I think we're having a bit of a technical difficulty with Fran, so let me kind of jump in on this subject, Jerry. It's something, I certainly have been watching here in California. We have some very important and lofty goals of moving to electric vehicles, and it's certainly going to impact local government because of our gas tax revenue. And so it's, I think, going to be a very important conversation, not only in California, but throughout the country. And how do we replace those lost gas tax revenues that local government relies on so heavily? So, Fran, I see you've been able to jump back on. If you want to finish off, I was just talking about how we'll have to look at replacing that gas tax revenue over time.
No, and thank you, Rita, for that. The wonders of technology. But I think a lot of conversations, and we're working in multiple states across the country. A lot of conversations are tying back to the tax code. We have antiquated tax rules and what's taxed. How do we make it contemporary with what's taking place today? So, is there a way to tax the generation of electricity? We're looking at e-commerce becoming a bigger part of it. Consistent and consuming. I think that major dialogue that's taking place across the country and something we're happy to talk more to you about and are very involved in a variety of states. So thanks, Rita.
Yeah, there's another factor here, isn't there? And that is, gasoline prices went up, then they started to come down. Now they've gone up again. Now they're starting to come down. That kind of volatility is probably going to induce more people to go into electric or plug-in hybrid cars. So that kind of exacerbates what you're talking about. But these new cars are much more expensive than older cars. So doesn't that kind of work in the other direction in terms of sales taxes? And I guess that's different for different locations, both because they are different locations and where the auto dealers are and the new way in which people are buying cars, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And various states will tax differently on gas consumption, fuel, or electric. For states that have a higher propensity for electric vehicles are probably not positioned to tax the electric consumption that goes along with those vehicles. So there's something that has to be filled there. And in other places where gas prices are lower, the tax rates tend to be correlate with that. So it's a variety of dynamics, and every state will be very different and has to look at it individually based on the makeup of their economy.
Yeah, so this is an important thing to keep our eyes on, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's going to become more exacerbated, especially in 10 to 15 years as the technology continues to advance and as we go forward.
Okay, so we've talked about this slide, and the thing is that the Fed can't really directly affect most of the items on here. Particularly, it can't affect very significantly the things that are driving the current year-over-year inflation rates. What it can affect are the interest-sensitive sectors. So let's take a look at interest rates and where they are and what we expect to happen with interest rates. That blue line that in the forecast is highlighted with the blue diamonds is the federal funds rate. That's what the Fed controls. And so we have one more increase in the Fed funds rate, a 25 basis point increase. And we put that in November. It might be December. It might be in the first part of next year. But our feeling is that the Fed is going to come out and increase interest rates slightly as a way of signaling that they're still serious about inflation. But a 25 basis point increase in interest rates won't move the needle basically at all. And then we have the Fed funds rate holding constant until we get into that very week 2024. And if you remember a few slides back, it was going to a 1% economy and almost to zero in the third quarter. So then we have the Fed decreasing the federal funds rate by that 25 basis points that they're going to increase it by in our forecast at the end of the year. And then a couple more 25 basis point decreases, not much to move the needle as well, but as a signal that the Fed will respond to increasing unemployment. And then seeing in 2025 the economy recovering, we have them holding the Fed funds rate high as they've been saying all along that they were going to do. The other thing to notice here are these three other lines, and they're the 10-year, 3-year, and 2-year Treasury bill rates. And to the left of where they all cross in the beginning of 2024, you have the 10-year below the other two rates. That's the inverted yield curve. And the yield curve was inverted because market participants felt that the Fed was going to lower interest rates fairly dramatically. And our feeling is that by the time we get to the beginning of 2024, there will be the realization that they're not going to do that. That even if they lower interest rates a little, they're still going to keep them high. And so the yield curve goes right side up, and that, I think should affect fairly dramatically. But I want to ask Fran and Reva about this. State and local financing for capital improvements.
Yeah, it's a great question. And from my perspective, I don't think it's having a dramatic impact as much as we might think. Projects that need to be done at the local level, whether it's through bonding or financing, people are continuing to pursue these projects across the country, whether it's for housing or infrastructure, things like that. There's still that desire and that need. I think if it costs a bit more, that's being factored in. I don't see projects being slowed down despite these rates necessarily in a variety of the states we work in. Reva, I'm not sure if you have a thought or two on that.
Yeah, I would second that. I think, especially in states where there are mandated projects, whether they're environmental or housing related, those projects are continuing. I do think on the local level that people take a pause and make sure that their budgets can support these long-term financing if that's how they're building things. But I agree with Fran on his comments.
Yeah, I think please,
go ahead, Fran.
I was just going to say, I think there's a real desire in most communities that we're working with to maintain the quality of life and services that the community expects, whether it's good roads, public safety, park and recreation, and people are willing to assume those costs to provide that level of service. It tends to become more bipartisan than you might expect because everyone lives in a community and they have expectations that they want met, and so they're willing to pursue all the avenues despite the rates where they might be.
Yeah, and that was really a leading question because, your answers are important for the forecast, for the economic outlook. On top of this is the Infrastructure Act, which is going to support the kinds of projects that you all have been talking about. So, basically what we're saying is that even though the yield curve is going right side up and interest rates are staying higher for longer, that particular avenue or mechanism by which interest rates affect the demand for goods and services is not like the past. but rather fiscal policy is working against monetary policy, and it's much less interest sensitive than it was before. So with that, let's go to the interest sensitive sectors. And here's Chairman Powell at his news conference, and you see the increase in the federal funds rate in this little chart on the right. And the first one we want to look at is housing. And again, I want to caution using data that was generated during the pandemic to make inferences about what's happening today post-pandemic. This is new building permits. It's seasonally adjusted annual rates. The latest one just came out from the census today, and so all the way over on the right, it drops by a little bit. But there was a surge during the pandemic. This was migration that happened from many states to places like Phoenix and Dallas and Austin and Nashville, people moving in part because they could work remotely. And so we saw a lot of migration, and that was that pandemic surge. And that's pretty much over with. So if we look all the way on the left-hand side, we see this is a time when the average 30-year mortgage rate was 4.1%. And so, here you have about 1.3 million to 1.34 million new homes being permitted every month. And if we go past that pandemic surge to today, we have 7.3% 30-year fixed mortgage rates. And we're up at, last month it was, or 2 months ago, 1.54 million permits issued. Last month it was down to just about the long-term average of 1.45. And so we have, in fact, an increase in building. That's not what you expect with higher interest rates. But what's happened was, what happened was that interest rates dropped, and they dropped dramatically, and people locked in mortgages by refinancing at 2.5% to 3%. Now, even though they might want to upsize or downsize, they're not willing to sell their homes and go into a 7.3% mortgage. And so we're finding depression levels of sales of existing single-family homes. So where does someone go that wants to buy a new home? They wants to purchase a home. They go to new homes, and builders have found their inventories are selling out even at a 7.3% mortgage rate. Inventories are getting low, and they can sell everything they build at a good price, and they're building more. So again, this goes exactly to the opposite of what we've seen in past recessions. My colleague, Professor Ed Leamer, wrote a paper saying housing is the business cycle because decreases in home construction have characterized most recessions, and we don't have that. We're not expecting a lot of growth above the historical trend, and that's one of the things that's going to impact 2024, but it's not going to be contracting, and that's an important indicator that we're not going to have a recession in the coming year.
Yeah, and just to add in, what we're seeing at the local level in a variety of states are rules and legislation being passed to try to expedite the building process, to alleviate a lot of the red tape in terms of permitting and environmental studies, because there is such a demand for new housing, and it has a direct correlation to job creation, and there's a supply and demand need. So local governments in many states are passing rules at the state level that are bypassing local laws in order to expedite the ability to construct more homes to meet that demand. And it ties into what Jerry said. The interest rate may not impact it, but the supply is there. And again, there's a need to create more housing. So there's a lot of legislative and regulatory work at the local and state levels across the country to help ease that strain.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, over the last 15 to 20 years, 15 years in the US, we have dramatically underbuilt housing. So, it's not just, say, San Francisco or Los Angeles where the market is supply constrained. You see it in Miami and Atlanta, in Salt Lake City. You see it across the country. And that's going to keep this home building up. Okay, so moving on to another sector that's interest sensitive, and that is automobiles. And so as we look here from left to right, we see that on the left-hand side, kind of the average quarterly sales of light vehicles. Light vehicles are pickup trucks, SUVs, and sedans, is between 4 and 4.5 million per quarter. And then, it drops in the Great Recession. It comes back, but not for long. And then we get, as we move over to 2020, you see the big drop there, comes back, inventories are gone, and now we have the chip shortage. So again, we have underbuilding of automobiles, and the fleet is aging and automobiles wear out. So in our forecast, we have a dip there. That dip is due to the UAW strike against the big three. We don't think that's going to be very long, and we think maybe we're actually too pessimistic here. The executive director of Ford Motor Company came out and said, we need to settle this strike now. The reason being that unlike 1953, when we had a big UAW strike, we had a long UAW strike against the big three, there's a lot of competition, and the big three's competitors want to take market share. So look for that to be a fairly short labor action. And then it comes back, and we have it just coming back to a little bit above average, and then kind of tapering off towards the end. So again, we may be too pessimistic here, and that's going to affect 2024 and our pessimism about the rate of growth in 2024. But higher interest rates are not tanking automobile sales.
Yeah, and Jerry, I would agree with you. We're seeing that in a variety of cities, again, across the country, where car sales in some jurisdictions are up very dramatically, where in others where they're fairly flat. I think it has to do with the demographic, the type of vehicles. But from talking with our clients, the interest rates don't seem to be impacting people dramatically about making that purchase. It comes back down to, do we need a new vehicle at this time? Love your thoughts about that. Because, some places where we expect sales to be actually depressed because they're lower socioeconomic, they're actually having high car sales. So I think it's varying from jurisdiction to jurisdiction across the country, but people still seem to need to have the need to buy light vehicles for work or things of that type.
And we certainly appreciate your slightly pessimistic outlook. I think it's better to be a little pessimistic and the reality hit us better. So from a budget perspective, that's how I always coach that.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But, to Fran's point, if you had a Ford F-150, the best-selling light vehicle in the U.S., but you bought it back in, say, 2006, you probably need to replace it. And the high gas prices say you can get an electric truck today, or you can as soon as the strike is over with. And the fact that interest rates are high is only going to be a slight deterrent. You really need to replace that truck, for whether it's for work or for pleasure. So, we're expecting increases in light vehicle sales in our forecast. Okay, moving to another interest-sensitive sector. And this is an important one because we normally see in recessions a real dramatic drop in orders for new durable goods. And you can see that in the couple of recessions that are highlighted here in gray. This is excluding transportation. The reason it excludes transportation is that on a monthly basis, if Boeing books an order, you get a spike up. If they don't book one that month, you get a spike down. But if you average the Boeing orders on this, you would find that it looks pretty much the same. So what we have is no decrease in durable goods orders. And we're seeing that in machinery, construction machinery, farm machinery. We're seeing it in automation. And you can see there's a slowing, but there's not a decline. And backlogs for factories are actually going up, not down. So interest rates are up, but so are durable goods. And
And
then,
we're seeing at the local level, the jurisdictions that are creating and manufacturing the durable goods are very resilient. They seem to be less impacted by the inflationary and trends that we were seeing, because it has an indirect impact on their economy, where those products are being produced. People are coming in, they're staying in the hotels, they're there for work. We're seeing their economy is very strong in the areas where these products are being delivered and manufactured.
right. And you know, the popular narrative is manufacturing left the US, and certainly a lot of it did. But look at this. This is the construction of new factories, and it is many-fold greater than it has been recently. New factories are being built all around the country, and you know, and we see them in New York, in Connecticut, in Texas, in sort of the obvious places like Tennessee and South Carolina, but also in California. And
Can you go into a little more detail too, Jerry, about how these new factories are going to impact local revenue sources and why they're being built, and specifically where?
Right. So when you see this new factories being built, this is not old style manufacturing of riveting and metal bending. You know, Rosie the riveter has been replaced by Rosie the robotics technician. And so we have automated factories. They're not producing textiles, they're producing sophisticated equipment, electronics, semiconductors, and they're being located close to customers, but also where the talent pool will allow the company that is building the factory to grow that factory. And you know, just one example, we saw a fairly large semiconductor factory in Austin, Texas, closed down. It's not in Austin; it's just outside of Austin. Closed down, or it's about to close down, and they're moving to California because the kind of people that they need to grow come from a deep talent pool, and the talent pool in Austin is not entirely used up, but is pretty tight right now. And so they're finding a better talent pool here. So you're seeing factories move to where you have that deep talent pool. And we're not talking about PhD physicists, we're talking about people who are coming out of two-year colleges with technical skills.
So, Jerry, in your view, for some places where traditional manufacturing might take place, whether it's in the Midwest or wherever it might be, is it strongly in your view that more education needs to take place in these two-year programs where people get technical skills so they have those positions? Because it seems like the textile type jobs are going away, and how do these communities best prepare for the future to attract good jobs and opportunities for their people?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because you know what needs to happen, and in particular in places, you know, that are losing traditional manufacturing, is a development of the skills for the 21st century. So this is the biggest issue, I think, for workforce development in the 21st century. And that can be done with partnerships between the local community colleges and businesses. And we're seeing more and more of that. But the businesses who come in and start new factories, they need to know that they can grow. And so there's a real role for local government to attract and retain these factories that have good jobs. And that role is making sure that the flow of technically qualified personnel is there. Okay, moving on to some other sectors. And I want to talk about consumption and defense and tech. So first is consumption. Consumption is 2/3 of GDP, and it remains strong. This is real, meaning inflation is taken out, personal consumption expenditures, and we're above trend. And if you notice on the right-hand side, it's increasing. And we just got the latest retail sales numbers for September, and they were off the charts. We are spending. One reason why we're above trend and we're not going back to trend, at least it doesn't look like we're going back to trend, is our preferences changed in the pandemic. We were sitting home for all of this time, And now, looking forward, the future is much more uncertain. When the future is much more uncertain, we tend to go for the purchase of goods and services that satisfy more immediate wants and really discount the future more. And so we've seen changed preferences post-pandemic that have held up consumption. And so this speaks directly to retail sales. And with these retail sales numbers up, Fran, what are you seeing across the country? Are there differentials, or is this really everywhere?
No, I think this is everywhere, and it goes back to what you said earlier, Jerry. In my view, people, there's still a pent-up demand to go out and have an experiential shopping experience or entertainment. People were at home buying, excuse me, off the internet for so long, but we're seeing malls across the country, not just traditional big box retail stores. People go to see a movie where they have dinner, they can have a cocktail during that. We have places like Top Golf. I just read recently where Netflix is now about to open locations where you can go and have an experience, not just see a movie, but have experiential. So that's really the shift. I think there's a craving, a demand for families and friends to go out and experience. And so we're seeing that across the country. And mall conversions are really going towards that type of thing. So people really want that ability to still buy online. And we're seeing online sales are still steadily growing up 3-4% on average across the country. It's not decreasing at the expense of people going out to shop. I think the online sales are steady, but more and more, again, the experiential, or people might go into a store and see something, then perhaps later go buy that same product online. It's the growing trend. What's interesting to me, Jerry, when I look at this slide is people are purchasing at a high level. Are we going to see an issue down the road with an increase in consumer debt because people perhaps are not paying cash, perhaps are charging?
Oops, we lost you, Fran, but I understand the question. Consumer debt will be going up, and that means that savings rates will be going down, but savings rates have been elevated. So I think that's not as big an issue. When we look at student debt, that does not seem to be as big an issue. A lot of that student debt is with individuals who are still in school, so they're not yet paying. And I think you're exactly right that one of the things that we found out, and I think all of us individually can relate to this, that during that 15 months of lockdown, we miss being out and being with people. And at least, here in California, brick and mortar retail is back. Not all brick and mortar retail, but exactly as you suggested, Fran, it is experiential retail. People want to go to stores. They want to touch things. They want to be around other people. And this is really driving consumption. And that's 2/3 of GDP. So that's strong demand for that part of GDP. And we saw
I'm assuming we'll see a reflection in that in those states that have sales tax too, Fran, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And here in California, you've got most services are not subject to sales tax. So there is a differential there. And with the shift towards more experiential and more services, that should have an adverse effect on sales tax. Are we seeing that in California communities?
Not quite yet, but I think that trend could potentially go forward. In California, for example, there's a lot of discussion legislatively to update what is taxable and not taxable. And I think that's a conversation we see in other states. So a state like Texas, as an example, has a broader sales tax base than California. So some of these experiential things are already taxed in a state like Texas, where they may not be in California. Same in the state of Louisiana, as an example. So state to state, these are going to continue to be looked at, especially as consumer buying habits and consumption changes. I think that becomes a necessary part of the fiscal solvency of local governments across the country to address. And that's certainly not an easy thing to do. If something isn't being taxed in your jurisdiction, all of a sudden you're asked to do it, that can cause some backlash and vice versa. So these are long-term problems that have to be factored in over time and thought about carefully.
So when we think about this in terms of the economic outlook, of course, there's different for different communities in terms of their public finance, but consumption is strong. The interest-sensitive sectors that we looked at, housing and automobiles and durable goods, all seem to be holding up quite well in the face of very dramatic increases in interest rates. So let's move on to some other sectors. And this one is important, but it is differentially important across the US, and that is defense purchases. So we have real defense purchases, and this is by the US government. And these are defense durable goods. That went up by 8% in the last budget. It's anybody's guess if we're going to get another budget. But it's hard to imagine that either Republicans or Democrats in Congress would not vote for an increase in defense spending. In addition to this, all around the world, our allies are seeing a much more dangerous world, and the recent events of the war in the Middle East just bring that to the fore, or the war in the Caucasus, and so other countries are spending a lot on defense, and about 40% of their purchases of defense durable goods comes to the U.S. And so this differentially affects us across states. California, Texas, New York, Connecticut, Georgia are going to get more of this than many other states. So, one can look at kind of their own community and see how it might be affected by this increase in defense spending.
And this is something we look at the local level in terms of the indirect economic impacts of these projects. So let's say a large contract is awarded to a company in Arizona. We would look at those. We would help with projections of what indirect benefit that would have to the overall economy of a jurisdiction. So that's something we can help jurisdictions look at if they're in a situation like that.
Right, and I just listed a couple of states, but within the greater St. Louis area, which spans 2 states, you have Boeing is increasing its manufacturing there and is investing in new factory space. You have, Fran, you just mentioned Arizona. Boeing also is increasing helicopter manufacturing, and that is, I think that may be in Mesa. So, very much localized in other states. But if you look at it from a state by state basis, defense spending is concentrated in a small number of states. Okay, so moving on to tech. So we've all heard about the tech layoffs, and tech is imploding. This is real GDP component, tech component for 2 sectors: professional, scientific, and technical services, and information. And those are tech intensive sectors. We don't have an actual tech sector because tech spans many sectors. But these are where those big companies like Google and Twitter and so on, who were having fairly sizable layoff announcements, live. And the blue line is professional, scientific, and technical services. The orange is information, and squint as you might, you can't find those layoffs. They would be all the way over on the right-hand side. We're seeing growth in tech. We're seeing fairly substantial growth in tech. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is that in the services, particularly in restaurants and accommodations, we have a labor shortage. And so firms are going to more and more capital goods, more automation, which I'm sure you notice when you go out to eat or when you travel. And they need to order software, and they need to order sophisticated technology in order to accomplish that. Things like being able to check into a hotel online and use your phone to open the door, or use your phone as a key. That requires software, and that's a demand for more software. What has happened here is that there are a lot of smaller tech firms who have absorbed the layoffs from the larger tech firms. And that's being driven in part by the demand for the green economy and investment in the green economy, helped by the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really a green economy act. And it's being helped particularly in California by a huge amount of venture capital funds that are going into AI because no one wants to be left behind. And so we're seeing all of these hold up the tech sector. So that is not imploding either. So that brings us to a summary. And in our summary, we have employment and income remain strong. In spite of what you might read in the paper, the economy is not in a recession. It hasn't been in a recession since 2020, and there are no indications it's going into a recession. But this is, sort of an interesting point because consumer sentiment seems to say that everyone thinks the economy is in very bad shape, right? And that's what Fran and Reva, that's what you all are hearing also, right?
Absolutely. I think so. However, the numbers belie that, when we look at revenues for jurisdictions, they're relatively flat incremental growth. We're certainly not seeing declines. So, it's steady Eddie right now, I think is the best way to put it. Just fairly flat, but with slight increases.
I mean, this is where it, becomes really important to look at data. Yep. and not doom scroll on X or whatever social media, because the data is really saying something different. And the media, kind of regardless, I think, of the political bent of the, of the media outlet, is reporting bad news. And so people are down. But, if you ask them, how are you doing personally? They said, well, I'm doing great. I have a job. I have a good income. My income's going up. I'm not worried about being fired. And then you say, well, how's everybody else doing? Oh, well, they're doing terribly. So everyone thinks they're doing fine and everyone else is doing terribly, which is a very unique thing, at least in economic history.
And I think when we look from a local government perspective, every jurisdiction is very unique unto itself. One city might be thriving because of its business base, and next door they may not be, depending on, again, the demographic and makeup. So I think it's really difficult to put a broad brush across how every jurisdiction is doing. Each one is unique in its own way and needs to really look at itself. And then within that, here's what we're doing, what might be the steps we can take to improve ourselves in terms of business attraction or retention and things of that nature. So within the bigger picture, at the micro level, locals are very different from one jurisdiction to another based on the factors that make up its community.
So Jerry, I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in, before you finish wrapping up your summary. Obviously we're all very worried about the wars going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East right now in Israel. So I'd love you to talk a few minutes before we get to the top of our hour about why is this outlook so strong when we have so many big issues going on in the world.
Okay, so let me quickly go through this because the next slide actually goes exactly to that. So we have interest rate rise. They cool the growth in the economy, but they don't push the economy into recession as they have in the past, because we have an expansionary fiscal policy, even while we have a contractionary monetary policy. And we still have an open question about future interest rate increases, so something to keep our eye on. And for those who've been calling a recession is coming eventually, because it always does, but not in the near term. The data just don't tell us that. So let's go to your question, Reva. Let me bring these up. Wider conflict in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and neighboring countries. These are big issues, and they could very much upset the forecast. When we think about them, they do increase risk in the sense of increasing uncertainty. So we should see higher interest rates as a consequence of that. But the question is, well, how does this settle out? Does Saudi Arabia, in the interest of getting a wider coalition of anti-Iran countries in the Middle East, increase oil production? Does the conflict between Israel and Hamas expand to be a much wider conflict? With Russia and Ukraine, a lot of concern about the elections in Poland, and does Poland go the way of Slovakia and Hungary? And to what extent does that war contain itself or expand? These are sort of important risks. We don't know what's going to happen. So we have to keep our eye on this and how this might affect the economic outlook, both for the aggregate, which I've been talking about for the US, and at the local level, which Fran and Rita have been talking about. Election worries is my next one. We have an election in 2024. Fran talked about this in the introduction. As we get closer, if it looks like it's a toss-up or anywhere close to that, that's going to increase uncertainty and is really going to affect the economic outlook, because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have very different economic platforms. And so who is elected, whether we're talking about Congress or the presidency, matters, and matters for the forecast going out into the 2025. Probably doesn't matter at all for 2024, but does matter for 2025.
And just to add to that on the election wars, it's an interesting trend, and I think a lot has to do with 24/7 news and social media. The election cycles tend to extend dramatically in recent years as compared to the past, when many countries you won't even hear about an election primary until a couple of months before an actual election will take place. I was just in New Zealand as an example. They had their elections a week ago, and there's rules around how soon you can start having campaigns and the conversations, where here it seems to be 24/7. And so I think it exasperates us all by being bombarded with it, irregardless of philosophies or viewpoints. It creates an extra tension that perhaps doesn't need to be there. So we have a trend there that has a psychological impact, I believe. It literally is worrisome to me, because it goes on for such an extended period of time. And so much can happen between now and the actual elections, as we spoke about at the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, and you know, if you ask a random person what's going to happen in the 2024 election, at least half the time they will tell you with certainty who is going to be elected, and yet we don't even know who the candidates are.
Correct.
So you know, as we get closer, the kind of uncertainty that this can create can be disruptive to the economy.
Yeah.
The last two, China, Taiwan, and the South China Sea, the Chinese economy is, well, no other way to say it, it's in a world of hurt. You have overbuilding of infrastructure, you have overbuilding of housing, all of the things that we don't have here that have resulted in our economy continuing to grow, they have there. Those that misalignment is going to require adjustment. It's big adjustment, and those are significant parts of the Chinese economy. And even though the Chinese government has started to put more stimulus into the economy, there is a real concern domestically in China about the impact of this on social stability. And in particular, China has followed a policy of export-led growth. Well, the Europeans aren't buying more from China today, and that's their largest market. We in the US, we're not buying more from China today, and we're the second largest market for China. And so export-led growth is pretty much done. And the question is, will China use aggressive activity in the South China Sea or with respect to Taiwan, both of which they've done a little bit of, a very small amount, but a little bit of, that leads to mistakes, and mistakes that would affect the outlook. And then the final one that I have here, which doesn't have as much impact on the near-term forecast, although in certain localities in the US, it does, is climate change. but also climate change migration. One of the reasons why we see so many people coming to our southern border in the US is because climate change has eliminated their jobs. And we see that also in Europe with the droughts in the Middle East and in Africa, resulting in migration. This is only going to get worse, only going to be magnified many-fold as we kind of look at the manufacturing centers in Asia. They tend to be in low-lying delta areas. So that's really problematic. So those are the risks of the forecast. They're significant. And those are the things that we really have to keep our eyes on, particularly with 2025 and beyond. And so with that, I'm going to end the slideshow and we can go to discussion and questions.
So thank you very much, Jerry and Fran, for that. I think there's a lot of things we need to keep watching and looking forward to talking about it further. So we have some really good questions that are coming in, and I'd like to run some by to you, Jerry and Fran, if you have anything to add. Our first question is about inflation, and that inflation is coming down rapidly, but everybody thinks it's high. Can you talk about what the disconnect is there?
Sure, and I think that's a really important question. So when you see the inflation numbers, or what the Federal Reserve sees as inflation numbers, are either the change in prices this month relative to last month, or this month relative to a year ago. It's not how high prices are, it's how much they've changed. But for us as consumers, when we, for example, go and buy a car, and we haven't purchased a car in, say, five years, we look at the price today of a car and a price 5 years ago, and it's much higher. And that's also inflation. It's not the inflation metric that that we hear about on the news. We say, wow, prices have gone up, or we compare our grocery prices today to what we were paying a year ago or 2 years ago, and see that it's much higher. And so we think about inflation in terms that are different from the way in which we actually measure inflation for policy purposes. So it's not that prices are high, it's that they are changing and becoming higher. And the average household is seeing these higher prices compared to a year, 2, 3 years ago, impacting their budget. And so I think that's the disconnect, or that's the way to connect it back up.
Great. Thanks, Fran. Did you have anything on that?
Yeah, and I think we all feel it on a daily basis when we just go to the grocery store. The price of eggs or price of meat or poultry are how much higher. It doesn't feel good when we're spending money there at these higher levels. And then in terms of from a tax perspective, that doesn't equate to more revenues at the local level. It doesn't feel good, and we're not used to it, and it causes us angst and concern for sure.
Yeah, and just to kind of further that, exactly, when we go to the grocery store, we don't say, oh, the price of eggs today is pretty much the same as what I spent last month, right? We say the price of eggs today is really high, and I used to spend much less. And so that is the inflation that most people think about, not what the Federal Reserve is looking at.
Great, thank you. Okay, our next question is that you had talked during the presentation that the Feds were going to lower interest rates. Why are they keeping rates high when we have a weak economy?
So for two reasons. One is those interest rates that we're experiencing today, they're not high historically. They are high compared to this long period of near zero interest rates. But historically, they're about in the right place. And the second is that even though the economy is weak, inflation has not come down to the target level that the Fed has. So they're trying to balance those. They'd like to avoid a recession. And that's why we have, some moderate decreases in interest rates. But, in point of fact, they're trying to keep interest rates at a level where if we do have a recession sometime in the future, and eventually we will have one, they'll have a lever to use that will be able to lower interest rates and counteract that weak demand.
Yeah, and as we've talked about throughout the presentation, despite the interest rates being up or down for consumer spending, people are willing to continue to spend for experiences or vacations or for other vital things, they are still spending despite the fact that the rates are higher. I think obviously it's more impactful if you're trying to purchase a home, but on smaller purchases, I think there's a greater propensity to spend and in many cases use credit to do so, despite the higher rates.
Right. And rates are higher, but they're not high.
Right.
And I think that's important. In the early 1980s, rates went up to 20%. And we're not even in double digits now. So we're sort of at normal interest rates given the rate of inflation we're experiencing today.
Right. I think we're all just still remembering that pandemic time. So if we take that out, factor that out, then we can look at things differently.
Yeah, exactly.
So our next question goes back to talking about war and what's going on, and it's a little bit lengthy, so give me a second. But basically, they're asking that, isn't war very costly in the long term? And so, do the long-term costs of war outweigh the short-term benefits? And are we looking at higher taxes or inflation as a result of that? So maybe kind of talk a little bit about that, because I know it's such an important subject for all of us right now.
Yeah, I think the person who asked the question is right. If we look historically, long wars are very costly, and they lead to a lot of political and social disruption. They lead to higher taxes. I mean, we've seen that kind of again and again over hundreds of years. The long wars that we had in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq would be exceptions. But the reason is that what the US government did was they stopped buying as many defense durable goods, as many airplanes and tanks and the other things that that supply the military. It's kind of eating into that capital in order to prevent a need for raising taxes over the long period. But larger wars and the kind of world that we see now does lead to the possibility that we're going to need higher taxes and more government spending in order to purchase those defense durable goods, in order to perhaps expand the size of our military.
And I think it goes back to some of the conversations we had earlier. There will be economic impacts to different parts of the country depending upon where these products or goods are shipped or manufactured. We certainly don't like to see our economy grow as relation to a world conflict or war, but there are impacts in various parts of the country related to this from an economic perspective.
Yeah, and I think one thing to understand in that regard, and this is one of the lessons of the war in Ukraine, is that wars become much more sophisticated, and so the demand for materiel to fight a war is a demand for sophisticated electronics, navigational devices, and the like. So very different from, say, World War II, whereas build tanks, build jeeps, build landing craft, and so we've got a real shift. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of the differential impacts on manufacturing, which is this is going to be sophisticated manufacturing. It's going to require a skilled workforce.
Well, let's certainly keep our eyes on all of that. I know it's something as the situation changes, we'll certainly get more information. So I think we have time for one more question. And I want to ask here, somebody asked about GDP, and it's immediately post-pandemic. Real GDP returned to historical trends. In 2024 and 2025, it's projected below that historical trend. Can you talk about why that is?
Sure. So, when we were looking at the interest-sensitive sectors, let's take the durable goods, for example. You saw that it was now growing much more slowly, growing much more slowly than before. Let's turn to housing, which is really important in terms of fluctuations in GDP and in economic activity and employment and unemployment. And that's grown. It's about at historical levels. We've underbuilt housing, so there's certainly a demand there, but the interest rates are keeping that from growing quite as rapidly. So it's not that the economy is contracting. but that it's just not growing as rapidly. So that's what's happening there. And then as prices adjust to the higher interest rates, for example, home prices adjust to those higher interest rates, and people start selling existing homes as well as new homes, then you get a boost to the economy and it starts growing again.
Yeah, from a local perspective, we're more optimistic post-pandemic for small businesses. As Jerry mentioned, 2/3 of our gross domestic product is small businesses. They were certainly hemorrhaging and closed in many cases during the pandemic. We're starting to see an increase in their activity, and their revenues are coming back up stronger. So as we're seeing a flattening from the larger groups, we are seeing a growth in the smaller businesses having a chance to rebound now that people are able to physically go to retail locations or restaurants, things like that. So there's a positive for some of the small businesses who are really impacted dramatically during the pandemic.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, Fran. I recall an article from NPR in Seattle about the layoffs from Amazon. And you would think that, Amazon is a very large employer in Seattle, and that would have a real impact. And it didn't. And the reason why was that all of these smaller tech firms and startup tech firms now didn't have to compete with Amazon for those employees. And so that the small businesses were able to grow. And so I think that's one of the things that, that we really are starting to see is small business expanding and looking at new areas, particularly in technology.
Great. Well, thank you. I guess I would summarize everything as there's some bad news and some good news, and hopefully we end up with just good news in the long run. But I really want to thank both of you for speaking with us today. Very insightful and very, very helpful for our audience. Thank the audience for tuning in and watching. And if you have any other questions, you can email us at succeed@avenueinsights.com. So once again, thanks so much, and hope to see you all on our next webinar.